Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, the Seapower and Projection Forces Subcommittee meets to hear testimony from the Department of Navy on the fiscal year 2021 budget. Before us today are Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition, James Gertz, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Warfighting Requirements and Capabilities, Vice Admiral James W. Kilby, and Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration, Lieutenant General Eric Smith. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. On February 10th, the Department of Defense presented to Congress a Navy budget that is at odds, many of us believe, with their own stated goals of achieving a 355-ship fleet. Instead of the 10 ships that we expected to see this year, we received a proposal, as the Congressional Research Service reported, for just 7, 2 of which are salvage ships or tugboats. Instead of 54 ships through 2025, we have a budget that cuts that number by 22% to 42 ships over the next 5 years. This budget represents the lowest number of combatants requested in nearly a decade. And to put this plan in context, it puts us at a shipbuilding rate and fleet size over the next 5 years below what was projected under the last administration, which was pursuing at the time a 308-ship goal. One of the most infuriating changes in this budget is cutting the Navy's program of record for production of 2 Virginia-class submarines per year to 1. This comes as combatant commanders have repeatedly warned of the looming reduction in attack submarine force levels that will see the fleet decline nearly 20% within this decade, beginning, ironically, in 2021, the same year the President's budget strikes a Virginia-class boat. Congress has strongly supported the 2-a-year build rate, and specifically the second 2021 attack submarine. Led by this subcommittee, the conference report for last year's NDAA stated the clear position that Congress expected the Navy to budget for 2 submarines in 2021. We authorized and funded a $200 million increase in advanced procurement to support procurement of this submarine. To date, we have provided at least $1.1 billion towards this boat. This baffling move was made even more confusing based on testimony that we've received so far in full committee. Last week, for example, HASC heard testimony from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that it was not in the best military advice, it was not in his best military advice to pull an attack submarine out of the budget. The acting Secretary of the Navy explained that he was informed of the decision only after last-minute budget moves were made without Navy input. The Chief of Naval Operations indicated that his top unfunded priority is the restoration of funding for a second attack submarine. And the Secretary of Defense, despite submitting and defending a budget that cuts the submarine in 2021, stated that he personally believes that we need even more attack submarines than currently planned. On February 12th, Ranking Member Whitman and I wrote to the Secretary of Defense requesting the Navy's 30-year shipbuilding plan by February 27th. Our hope was that this plan would help our subcommittee make sense of the change in direction this budget represents for shipbuilding and the submarine fleet. I say request, but in reality, this plan is required by federal statute to be submitted with the budget. That requirement is clear. It does not say that the Secretary may present a 30-year plan at the time of his choosing. It says clearly that the Secretary shall. A few days ago, the Secretary wrote to Chairman Smith indicating his position that submission of the budget's 5-year planning projection is sufficient. Let me be clear. A 5-year plan is not sufficient according to the law. This subcommittee has produced shipbuilding marks as part of the NDAA year in and year out, relying on the 30-year requirement in order to make long-term investments, which is inherent to shipbuilding, unlike other Pentagon acquisition programs. So today, all Congress will see before we mark up the defense bill is a limited 5-year plan, a 5-year plan that, as a matter of plain fact, is verified by the CRS, puts us on a path to barely reach more than 300 ships within the next 5 years, let alone 355 or 390 anytime soon. As our witnesses and members of this panel know all too well, shipbuilding is a long game, with progress measured not just in years but in decades. Without a fuller understanding of what informs this request and where it goes from here, 2021 risks being a lost year in shipbuilding that will take years to recover from. So to our witnesses here with us today, I say we can and we must do better. Our panel has a hard-earned reputation for punching above its weight and producing tangible results for our Navy and Marine Corps. You can expect to see us do that again this year as we begin work on the 2021 Defense Authorization Mark for Seapower programs. And now it's my privilege and honor to yield to the ranking member, my good friend, Congressman Rob Whitman.
Well, thank you, Chairman Courtney. I want to thank you so much for your leadership and for your steadfast conviction to make sure we have the Navy that this nation needs. I really appreciate that, and want to thank our 3 witnesses for joining us today. Gentlemen, the administration has been consistent with their drive to expand the capacity of the United States Navy. President Trump foresaw the great power competition and called for a 355-ship Navy. Unfortunately, his vision and foresight have not been replicated in the budget request. This relentless drive on behalf of legacy curmudgeons to hold back implementation of the National Defense Strategy will continue to delay the required reform. It is apparent that we need to move toward a maritime strategy that will require both long-range strike and naval power. Yet the budget request continues to emphasize COIN operations and legacy force structure allocations. We have to do better. Of all of our nation's defense procurement programs, shipbuilding is by far the longest, most complex of any acquisition program. Shipbuilding requires years of planning, billions of dollars to capitalize the shipyards, and lengthy periods of ship construction. Yet, there are some in the administration who continue to believe that the industrial base is a faucet that can be shut off and shut on. Some believe that in the short term, we can add shipyards to expand our ship construction capacity. The reality is starkly different. I believe that this shipbuilding budget request is an attempt to begin to turn the faucet down. We are actually on the precipice of putting a number of shipyards out of business. And unfortunately, the administration's overestimation of the capacity and elasticity of the industrial base will have negative repercussions for a very long time. Central to these concerns is the budget request to order a single submarine. We are on an inextricable path to reduce our attack submarine force structure from 51 to 42 submarines. The combatant commanders are begging for more undersea strike capacity. Yet, this budget request seeks to perpetrate this egregious deficit. The administration compounds this shipbuilding deficit by an accelerated ship retirement schedule that includes 4 littoral combat ships, 4 cruisers, and 3 amphibious ships. Some of these ships have only been in commissioned service for 6 years or less. The math on these retirements, compounded by an anemic shipbuilding request, points us in the wrong direction. Gentlemen, I'm not a mathematician, but building 8, 6 of which are warships, retiring 11 doesn't get us to 355 by 2030, period. Can't get there. Furthermore, the administration continues to ignore the plight of our nation's sea lift. The Navy may point to the budget request to procure 2 used ships in fiscal year 2021. Unfortunately, the administration also endorsed a legislative proposal that would virtually eliminate any new ship construction effort for these sea lift vessels. General Franks, the then 7th Corps commander during Desert Storm, understood the value of these forces when he was quoted as simply saying, "Forget logistics, you lose." In sea lift, the only change from the last year is that our sea lift force has aged another year, can only accomplish 40% of the required tasking, and the administration is prepared to accelerate the decline of this essential logistics force. As to the Marine Corps, I'm actually delighted with the vision that the Commandant has placed before our nation. I continue to be impressed with this change and look forward to more actionable items to implement a long-needed turn to the future of military conflict. My hope is that the Marine Corps is timely in implementing these needed changes. Again, I appreciate the Chairman for his leadership in having this important hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. And now, Mr. Gertz, I think you'll be presenting a statement for the panel. Is that correct? Sir. Okay, the floor is yours.
Chairman Courtney, Ranking Member Whitman, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity to appear before you today to address the Department of the Navy's fiscal year 2021 budget request. Joining me today are Vice Admiral Jim Kilby, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Warfare Requirements and Capabilities, and Lieutenant General Eric Smith, Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration. Sir, with your permission, I intend to provide a few brief remarks for the record.
Without objection.
We thank this subcommittee and all of Congress for your leadership and steadfast support of the Department of the Navy. Your efforts to fully fund the fiscal year 2020 budget for 12 ships helps provide the stability and predictability in funding that enable us to build and sustain the naval force the nation needs. And in so doing, execute the maritime component of the Naval Defense Strategy, or National Defense Strategy. Since the start of fiscal year 19, we've delivered 11 battleships to the fleet, including most recently the future USS Tripoli, our newest large deck amphibious ship. Today, with the USS Tripoli delivered, we have 78 ships under construction or under contract and 46 under construction. We expect to take delivery of 12 ships in fiscal year 20 and award contracts for 8 additional ships this year. As we continue to modernize the fleet, we've also focused on ship and aviation maintenance, delivering higher aircraft mission capability rates, improved on-time deliveries of ships for maintenance, and reduced maintenance backlog for our nuclear-powered fleet. We achieved key milestones on the USS Gerald R. Ford, returning her to sea after a post-shakedown availability and qualifying all aircraft in her air wing and readying her for deployment, while launching the future USS John F. Kennedy ahead of schedule at a 16% reduction in labor hours from CVN 78. We're on track to begin full construction of Columbia in October 2020, with 80% detailed design complete at construction start, the highest level of completion at construction start in a modern shipbuilding era. Our use of agile and innovative contracting approaches have leveraged the many authorities Congress has provided, enabling us to deliver our ships, aircraft, and weapons with over $25 billion in savings to the taxpayer over traditional acquisition methods. Although our budget reflects the hard choices we had to make given a flat budget, our 21 request builds on these prior investments and improved acquisition outcomes in order to provide the best balanced force in support of the National Defense Strategy for the resources available. It continues key investments in advanced technology and modernization, prioritizing recapitalization of the ballistic submarine force. It supports the sustainment and readiness recovery to deliver credible forces today while pursuing increased lethality and modernization to ensure readiness for the future fight. It includes procurement of 44 battle force ships within the FYDP and aims to continue a healthy industrial base that's critical in meeting this demand. And we appreciate the continued strong support Congress has always given us in preserving that industrial base through our shipbuilding programs. Thank you for the strong support of the subcommittee and for all that you've always provided our sailors, Marines, and their families. And thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. We look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gertz. And again, we've got a lot of members here who I'm sure are bursting with questions. So I'm going to kick it off, and I'm not going to belabor the point, but I do feel just it would be helpful on the question of the Virginia-class submarine program, just to get a couple sort of baseline bits of fact out, so which will help us as we move forward. So right now, the Block 4 contract is underway in operation, the 2-a-year construction schedule teamed up between Virginia and New England. And then Block 5, which was just executed at the end of the year, again, contemplates a 2-a-year cadence, but by cutting a sub, we're going to reach a year where that's going to dip down to only 1 in terms of the construction schedule. Columbia, as you point out, begins construction late this year. The real ramp up starts in about 2023. So the question I have is 2 questions. Number one, do you have confidence right now that the shipyards are capable and have the capacity to handle the 2-a-year build rate as required under Block 4 and at least the first 4 years out of the 5-year Block 5 contract?
Yes, sir. I had less confidence, candidly, 6 to 9 months ago, where we were seeing some of the Block 4 deliveries starting to move to the right. And the concern was, could we maintain the cadence we needed to and not add risk to Columbia? And I've said repeatedly before, the number one way to reduce risk to Columbia is a stable, well-performing Virginia program. And so at that time, we started working very closely with the shipbuilder to get that end of Block 3, start of Block 4 performance stabilized. I'm happy to report over the last 6 months that's stabilized. My concerns are not now, can they execute? They just need to continue to execute. At the time, we created a potential relief valve for that 10th ship in the multi-year. at this point and in the decision-makings coming up to our budget release, it was more an affordability issue, not an execution issue. I'm confident they can execute the ship.
Well, I appreciate that, because I mean, it's almost like there's an intuitive sort of reaction that maybe, you know, the bandwidth is getting too clogged and it's too much. But the fact is, again, as you said, there's been some really good work done. The construction readiness review process, which I think has helped both yards get the modular units delivering on time. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, sir. If you recall, last year we also added a program executive officer for Columbia. And so the goal out of both sides was have a team focused on getting Columbia ready, getting the design ready, getting that ship ready to go, and then have a team dedicated to getting Virginia where it needed to be. It wasn't where it needed to be, you know, with high confidence. It is now, and so our intent is to build on that. We have the flexibility, given budget is included this year, to bring that ship back into the multi-year. As we were in the end game, it just frankly became an affordability issue with all the other constraints on the budget.
Okay, so again, we've sort of you know, confirmed that the 2-a-year build rate is you know, executable. I guess then the question is then if we lose that last sub in the Block 5 contract, which would be around 2023, which is at the same time ramp up is occurring. I mean, the fact is that it may add that sort of confluence of events may add risk to Columbia. Is that a correct way to view things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think submarine construction is very sensitive to cadence. And the number one thing we can do is stability and get on a cadence. And, you know, as we went from 1 year to 2 a year and trying to hold that cadence, that is where we need to preserve it. Where it's also very sensitive to dips in workload. And so there is some work we're going to have to do at the end of 23 with the shipbuilder and understand and manage any potential dip in the workforce requirement, because the last thing in the world we want to do is be laying off folks right before we need to climb this giant Columbia wall. And so I think we'll have to watch that closely, work closely with you and the shipbuilder, with the committee here and the shipbuilder to manage our way through that piece. If we cut short and have a large gap at the end of Block 5 before having Block 6 move in and Columbia start up, that will be a risk to execution, not only in Virginia, but in Columbia.
So again, I think it's really important to sort of flesh that out. Today, you know, we've had probably 100 or so submarine suppliers sort of crisscrossing the hill, and I talked to a number, as well as Mr. Whitman did this morning. This budget, frankly, has kind of sent a little bit of a shockwave in terms of just their own decisions about investing in capital, and you know, so you know, it may be intuitive that, you know, this budget kind of lessens and makes it easier for execution, but in fact, it really actually creates disruption. The other point I just wanted to sort of quickly walk through with you is that if, let's say, you know, this cut goes through next year or the year after, Congress wants to say, well, you know what, we actually probably should add a submarine later. The fact is the cost of doing that would be cheaper or excuse me, more expensive than what the cost of trying to restore this year's submarine. Is that is that an accurate analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. At some point, you don't have the capacity, again, back to cadence, to speed cadence up. This is the year I would say we need to either add that ship in this year, or then we'll just have to you know, work on that at the to start of Block 6. So we're very sensitive kind of to that cadence, and not I don't think there is a way to execute 3 in a Columbia year with a high degree of success.
So with that awareness that it's really now or never if we're going to protect this build rate, I mean, I think that's very helpful. You know, as the subcommittee moves forward in terms of trying to address this, and again, there's high interest on both sides of the aisle to do it. I just want to, again, as in the past, whether it was the Bush administration, the Obama administration, this subcommittee has been willing to work with the Navy and obviously all of your team to try and find a way to address, obviously, what I think is, you know, people really are very concerned about. So with that, I'll now yield. Okay, yield to Mr. Whitman, who.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to defer my time until later, and I'm going to go to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Mr. Gertz, thank you for We were discussing your deep Northeast Wisconsin ties, which I very much appreciate. In your testimony, you implicitly call out Northeast Wisconsin for delivering the JLTV 4 months ahead of schedule, which we're very proud of that, and hope the Marines are appreciating that as well. I'm hoping you can clarify something on the record. Last week, I spoke with Secretary Modly about the additional budget that would be needed in order to buy, build, man, and maintain a fleet of 355 ships compared to the current 293 ship fleet we have today. His answer was about 120 to 130 billion over 10 years, and I just wanted to make sure that that was in fact the all-in cost, including manning and maintaining, and not just acquisition.
Yes, sir. Maybe 2 points to reinforce Secretary Modly's comments. One, that is the all-in cost. It's not just the procurement cost, so that includes the operating maintenance, all the bills that are associated with it. And two, we don't see there's a significant industrial base limit to achieving that. We'll have to work closely with the industrial base, and obviously there's a lot of concerns in the near term, but we see that that is achievable from an industrial base perspective. So it's not industrial base limited, but that dollar figure was not all just procurement for ships. It also included the manpower, and Admiral Kilby can provide additional detail if needed.
Sure. Well, maybe I have to follow up. Appreciate that. And I think then on Friday, Secretary Modly spoke at the Brookings Institute and talked about the potential for a 390 ship fleet, or even potentially a 435 ship if you include unmanned vessels. So same question, how much additional budget would the Navy need in order to afford the total ownership cost of a fleet of that size, 390 ships excluding unmanned, or 435 including unmanned?
So, sir, thanks for that question. The additional ships alluded to by Secretary Modly are, of course, being discussed right now, and we owe that discussion with the Secretary of Defense. But they're not the same. It's not the same scale as battle force ships as we characterize them today, destroyers and submarines, et cetera. So I think some of those ships will have less of a total bill, but there'll still be an increase. So the types of things we've studied over the last couple of years with the Marine Corps and the Navy are smaller amphibious ships to help support littoral operations in a contested environment, smaller logistics ships to help support distributed maritime operations. So I don't want to say they'll have no cost, but they'll have a lesser cost. So I think that overall figure, as granular and macro as it is, includes all appropriations and would not be adjusted well out of limits from what was described in that original statement from you in the testimony.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to crudely point out, less eloquently than Chairman Courtney and Ranking Member Whitten have in other ways, is there's an obvious disconnect here between the considerable additional resources we're hearing directly from the Navy in order to meet that statutory goal of a 355, if not a 390 or 435 ship fleet, and what we've been presented in this budget. I will say, though, while we await the coming of the INSFA, like Godot, it shall arrive at some point, there are things we know we need to build now, right? In the FIDIP, maybe you could speak to that, Secretary Gertz?
Yes, sir. The budget we've sent over demonstrates those ships we know we need to build. The ships we need to build in 21, and again, not all we would have liked to have built or planned to build the year prior. The ships in there, under any scenario I can imagine, are solid ships. We need to build those ships. They're foundational, as are the ships we have in the future years defense plan. What we're really talking about as we talk about IMSA and 30-year shipbuilding plan a little bit is what's the longer term trajectory, and with those battle force ships, what other complementary ships might we want to include in that mix to work that overall joint strategy to compete and win on the global scale.
And in the 26 seconds I have left, Secretary Gertz, can you give us a sense of whether frigates will be produced in enough numbers to require 2 yards to produce them?
So our priority right now in frigate is to do the down selection credibly, fairly, and with great confidence, and get that ship, whichever one's selected, built and in the fleet as soon as possible. My guess is once we get that ship in the fleet, that ship will be in high demand, and we will look for ways to accelerate it and more than likely build more of it. That's a guess. But our first priority is execute the source selection, pick the right ship, execute that lead ship well, and then get into serial production. From there, I foresee a lot of different branches and sequels in terms of how many. And if we can follow up, I think Admiral Kilby can discuss how that will fit into the future architecture.
Well, I'm out of time, but-
There's no architecture I've seen where frigate isn't a major piece of it.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. I think that's the first time Samuel Beckett has been quoted at a subcommittee hearing. So, Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Secretary, Admiral, General, good to have you here. First of all, I want to echo the statements by our chairman and our ranking member on the considerable concern we have on the sub build rate. We've been to England, seeing how the tubes are getting ready for the Columbia, but we've seen the infrastructure, building up a workforce, that industrial base. It does not turn on and off like a spigot. I know you understand that, but as it was just mentioned, somehow there's a disconnect here. But I just want to shift a little bit and talk about what we have and how do we get it to the place we need it and the time we need it. So the turbo activation exercise, which was 60-some ships with only 64% available for tasking. And that's just, can they get it running and moving? Does not test the equipment on board, the cranes, the lifts. In fact, I would suggest that in any future demands that there needs to be spot on, not every ship, but to see what on the ship is working. Because it can be moving, but if you can't load it, you're dead in the water, and it seems to be a real void that's taking place. But let's talk about that organic surge fleet that we're trying to create. Year after year, we hear we're not getting close. This year, we had the study done, and it proves that. What are we doing?
Yes, sir.
It really changes fundamentally. We keep talking about it, and 2 ships doesn't do it.
Yes, sir, it doesn't do it. We're kind of taking a 3-pronged approach. I'll kind of address maybe your questions on the Ready Reserve fleet at the macro, and then I think a lot of where we've been doing a lot of our study and thought is logistics and combat and placement, even larger than that, which quite frankly, we were not where we needed to be in the 2016 force structure assessment on that major part of the fight. It was focused mostly on the battle force ship, and a lot of work has been done, and where we're talking with the Secretary is really how do we address all the other parts of the battle, not the main battle force. In terms of, I would agree with your strategic sea lift, we need to really get after it. We put in additional money for maintenance, about $200 million more, just for maintenance of the ships we have. As you know, we put in money in 21 and in 22 to get after buying some used ships. And we have some money in 23 to buy new. Candidly, I'll tell you, we are not at the place yet where I'm comfortable with the cost benefit of buying the new. And so we've got, early returns from industry. Those are very expensive ships, over $1 billion for some of these ships. And that's not, quite frankly, not going to be affordable. And so our effort right now is, first off, get maintenance money to the fleet we have, to your point, make sure, as old as they are, they can at least perform the mission they have, buy some used vessels quickly, and then really work hard on this CHAMP or whatever program we need to do to get numbers out there greater than onesie twosies.
So that's the physical side, the ships. Let's talk about the fleet, the mariners that we don't have. How do you plan on supplementing that? The ones we have are not exactly spring chickens, and the replacements aren't coming in anywhere near what you need.
Yeah, I think we have to work closely with MARAD in that capacity as well. That's a little more on their side of the fence than ours, but it's something we've got to address. And then I would also say we have to look at not just the strategic, can we get it to the theater? Very important, that's the first piece. Second piece is once we get it to theater, can we get it to the Marines and sailors or soldiers who need it, or airmen? That's the other piece. So we got a fixed strategic lift, but we've got to do more than that. we've also got to look at the inner theater and the last tactical miles element, particularly in a contested environment.
So with 45 seconds to go, if you were called on today to replicate our lifts that we had during the first Gulf War, could we do it?
We would do it, but it would be painful, and we probably wouldn't do it with the level of confidence that the nation needs. And even if we did the lift of Desert Storm, the next fight isn't going to be a Desert Storm. That will be necessary but not sufficient. So we've got to do a lot more than just the strat lift. We've got to get logistics right for the whole theater in a contested environment.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norcross. General Bergman.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to all of you for being here. You know, as I watch the TV screen and knowing that, let's say, other countries are watching us, not all of whom are our friends, and they look at us having the discussion, and they're putting their chess pieces in their development. It kind of unnerves me a little bit that in our attempt to be, my word, honest brokers on both sides of the dais here, that we are being too predictable. And ship build, you don't, we use the term often about with the bigger the ship, the longer the input on the rudder before you actually get a turn in that ship. Again, 355, 435, 390, just rings as arbitrary, okay? So the point is, we got to have to come to some number. But I don't understand why, with some of the ships that we're going to take out of commission long before their service life is over, why we wouldn't, can you give me a reason why we wouldn't keep them in some level of capability in the event something happened? So when there was a natural transition of the passing of the baton, help me here with the why of taking these ships out of commission early in their service life.
So, Congressman Bergman, I'll start and get joined by Secretary Gertz if necessary. But when we put together our budget, we followed 4 priorities. One was to fully fund Columbia. Second was to restore readiness. Third was to increase capacity and lethality, and modernization, to not allow those ships to not be equipped with what they needed to be relevant. And fourth was capacity. So as we tried to put this together in a challenging budget, we viewed those ships that we identified to be decommissioned as less valuable, not valuable, but less valuable for the other things we wanted to fund on that prioritization scheme.
Money from operating the ships to put it in other programs? Do I
Sure.
get that right? Okay. It's not about money, it's all about money, right? Okay, that's some of the issues that we count on you all in your philosophical and intellectual honesty in your mission to create that naval, force of the future. And speaking of that naval force of the future, Lieutenant General Smith, during the hearing today, we've heard much about the shipbuilding budget. We just talked about it, and we certainly look forward to seeing the 30-year shipbuilding plan. One of my concerns about the Marine Corps is the ability to give input to the plan as the Corps. Has the Marine Corps been provided an opportunity to comment on or contribute to the Navy shipbuilding plan?
Congressman, we have from the get-go. I've been in 33 years, and the level of coordination and integration, not just cooperation. Cooperation signifies that we're being friendly. Integration and coordination has never been better. Admiral Kilby and I work together literally every day. I see him more than any other Marine Corps general officer. We have been in the INFSA and in all of our studies that we have done for the last couple of years, but most especially the last, say, 8 months, we have been literally side by side working through this so that the Marine Corps' needs and interest in support of distributed maritime operations, our contribution to those fleet commanders has been completely incorporated. And hard choices are being made, sir, but we are completely tied at the hip so that we can support the fleet commander.
Okay. And just a few seconds left. I'd ask you to take this for the record. This is about incorporating training and simulation. You know, when General Clark was, Admiral Clark was CNO and put all the billions of dollars into the Great Lakes Naval Training Center there, I mean, it really was a 21st century vision of training sailors in their basic training to get them ready for the fleet. And kudos to him and his vision at the time. I believe we'd like to hear from you especially about how we're going to incorporate the training of the future, utilizing simulation, basically getting the sailors ready for the new technologies before they even walk up that, you know.
Yes, sir. We'll take that for the record, or if we have time in another round, I can give you some more.
Well, you know, let's
discussion.
put it this way: when you got something to see, let's take a look at it, or a plan, or a timeline, or whatever. Again, no hurry on it, but it's going to be important that we keep ahead, because what changes quickly is the digital side of things, and what we're using as training capabilities. The ship's hull is probably going to be the ship's hull.
To your point, sir, we have to make sure we match the absorption rate. We can generate a lot of technology and incorporate it fast. If we can't absorb it, it won't do anything productive for the fight.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Loria.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. And I feel somewhat like we did this in reverse, because we did the full HASC hearing about the Navy prior to the Seapower one specifically. But over the course of those hearings, we've heard a lot of information that's been somewhat conflicting and then been added on top of. So at the original hearing, Acting Secretary Modly told us that the 355-ship Navy that has been mandated by law and that we are seeking to achieve, that he thought we could get there in 10 years. And then I just heard you say today, there's a quote, I wrote it down, that there are no constraints on the industrial base. Did I understand you correctly, that you feel that there are no constraints on the industrial base to get us to 355-ship Navy in 10 years?
Yes, ma'am. What I was, I guess, trying to communicate there is the industrial base could support getting to 355 ships in 10 years. That doesn't mean the resources available to get there are in the budget. But in terms of when I look at the industrial base and the capacity we have the capacity to get there. It may not be exactly matched to the perfect set of ships to get there, but we have.
So are you trying to say it's like a pick and choose? Like if they can build something in Wisconsin and Representative Gallagher's district will just build that, even if it's not what you want, just so we can get to 355? Is the number important or the capability? I'm getting even more confused.
So I apologize for confusing you. What I'm saying is we have the industrial capacity within the United States to build that many ships in 10 years. There are
But
some
what we're
areas
doing
where
to our industrial base and our suppliers, and there's no better example than with the Virginia-class submarine and delaying the submarine, is the fact that they want to invest, they want to build the ships, they want to hire and train the workforce, but we keep changing the plan. And last year at these hearings, I brought up the 30-year shipbuilding plan as an example. Well, if the 30-year shipbuilding plan changes every single year, in years 1 to 3, not the end of it, 20 to 30 years from now when we could expect there's changes, but if it changes the immediate plan every year, how is it a plan? How can the industrial base plan for that? And moreover, I believe last week, Acting Secretary Modly also said at a Brookings Institute breakfast that the number wasn't even 355, it's 390 or more in this much anticipated force structure assessment. So can you comment further on that? Give us some insight. And then the 390, what's that time frame? Is that also within a decade?
Ma'am, I guess I will hold my comments in terms of industrial base to the 355. And I believe the question was, is it possible? It is certainly possible. There's not a fundamental limitation to get there other than the dedication of resources. 390 is, again, that's a different set of numbers, different set of assumptions. I'm not going to comment on kind of timeline to get to that part. I'm more responding to the NDAA on the administration's position that we aim to get to a 350 plus Navy. We can do that from the industrial base side. Certain elements of the industrial base are more limited than others, submarines being one, but we have capacity
think
in
about
other elements.
the workforce and the industrial base. 1/4 of the shipbuilding and repair that happens in the entire country happens in Hampton Roads, right where Mr. Whitman and I live and work. And we talk to these suppliers and industrial base partners every day when we're back in the district and we hear about their challenges. Even if you just look at the submarines, We've spoke to the suppliers of the fuel for our submarines. We put them in a precarious situation when the demand signal is not steady enough for them to be able to predict and maintain the activity that is absolutely essential to maintain that critical national security pipeline of fuel for our nuclear reactors, for our carriers and our submarines. And I think that this year's budget, with this removing the Virginia-class submarine, puts that supply chain at risk. And to come in and say that there's no constraints on the industrial base, I mean, I truly think that that sounds like we're tone deaf to what we're hearing every day from our industrial base, specifically in an area like Hampton Roads, where a lot of this work takes place. So I believe my time is about to expire, so I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Loria. General Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. I started out, and I think you guys are doing a great call, and I think you guys may be getting beat up over other people's issues. But I just want to state this. I was here in 2016 when I came on this committee, and we fought extremely hard with Chairman Thornberry and Ranking Member Smith at the time, and now vice versa, to get you guys the budget, the top line, that every single service asked for. And we did away with CRs. We've had one in the last 3 years. But we continue to get pushed back on us. We don't have a large enough budget. It's a flatline budget. It's all those things. We fought extremely hard. We took hard votes on both sides of the aisle. We got beat up over it. We've given the Navy, Air Force, Army, Marine Corps, every single thing that you asked for, without exception. The personnel numbers, the operations, maintenance budgets, the new ships, everything. We plan for that thing, and it goes back to what Ms. Loria was talking about. And then we keep changing it every year. And the bottom line is capabilities driven. We've got to have the right ships and the right mix at the right time. But we can't decide that this year, change that plan next year. Ingle's in my district, or not in my district, in my state. I consider the whole state, I guess, my district. But it's hard. We just told them we're not going to build a $630 million American-class LHA due to reprogramming of the budget. So when are we going to fix that? When are we going to build that ship? What are we going to do to get back in line?
Yes, sir. For that ship, actually, in the 21 budget, we've accelerated that. It was going to be a 24 ship. We've actually accelerated it to a 23 ship. I will acknowledge the reprogramming of the money. We will have to put that in the budget to make up for the money that was reprogrammed to execute that ship. But the Department of Navy is committed to that ship. In fact, like I said, we have accelerated that in the budget. And to the point, I think my comment on the industrial base got a little bit, I didn't present it clearly. I understand that it is all about consistency and long strategic planning and having stability in the industrial base. And then I've heard from others that we don't, even if the
no, I think you get it. Let me reclaim my time because I got very short, and I just want to talk on some really. General Atomics is in Tupelo, Mississippi, and they're the second Virginia-class submarine, which is built by them. Did it fall out of the budget as a result of concerns you have with the industrial base, or was it strictly budgetary?
Sir, it was, from my perspective, strictly an affordability issue.
And then I want to talk just a little bit about something else that's pretty near and dear to me. And recently I was at the Surface Navy Association annual symposium, and we had discussions about boat and ship requirements from shore to ship medical evaluation, and we had some hard questions. And we've got to have those soft power, which are also necessary for us Marines and Army guys who want to make sure we have a place to get evac. Where are we, and what are you doing for our medical evacuation, and what are we going to do to have those plans in place?
So, sir, I'll start and get joined either by General Smith or Secretary Gertz. But in the last, I would say, 2 years, we've recognized, we've tried to revitalize the logistics approach. One of those R's, we call them, 5 R's, is resuscitate vein. To that end, we, thanks to you, were able to program a kit in an EPF to have Roll 2 care, ambulance, capability to medevac larger number of sailors or Marines than we've had to in the past. I think that's absolutely where we need to go. We're continuing on that path to identify that requirement, but that's the start of that. That doesn't obviate the requirement for Roll 3 care, and we're committed to taking care of our hospital ships and coming up with a more solvent plan for that in the future. But Mercy and Comfort are the Roll 3 care ships for now.
Thank you. I mean, that matters. I'll tell you, soldiers and Marines and the Navy and Air Force guys who are on the ground fight a lot harder when they at least know they have an opportunity to get that magic hour and to get back and to have a chance of life saving. That is really important. And also the use of that in soft power. When we have a Puerto Rico or someone where we have hurricanes and you guys can roll in with those ships, it is just a great, great way for America to show we don't just flex our muscles, we help people too. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Gertz and Admiral Kilby, last year in front of this committee, Vice Admiral Murs called the Flight 3 DDG-51 the most powerful warship on the planet. Noted that it has dual air and ballistic missile defense capabilities that he's really looking forward to seeing out in the fleet starting in FY23. And that, you know, with that introduction, that the Navy would be going Flight 3 all the way through. I think it was just yesterday. Got a story here that you might have seen where the EUCOM commander, General Todd Walters, was calling for 2 more destroyers to theater in EUCOM at Rota. I think specifically looking for ballistic missile defense purposes, and just the ability to have a good, strong presence in the Black Sea, you know, in a good spot to be able to get into the Mediterranean, the Middle East, to get up to the North Atlantic, North Sea. But of course, the Navy had expressed some concerns, I think, in recent years about pulling destroyers away from carrier strike groups. So I think, you know, plenty of evidence that we need to have the capacity to meet demand and not have to, you know, pick winners and losers in terms of what's the, you know, more important priority here. So I wanted to ask, current multi-year procurement for DDG 51s only goes through FY 2022. What are your plans regarding FY23 and the potential for another multi-year procurement for the next Flight 3?
Yes, sir. In terms of acquisition, I'll answer that, maybe ask Admiral Kilby from a warfighting perspective, but I would agree with your assessment. They're an awesome warfighting machine. We want to get as many of them out as we can. In terms of acquisition strategy, as we look to that, you know, we have not laid in a multi-year yet. But we've saved, you know, billions of dollars to those effective strategies. So given the number of ships I believe we'll be procuring in terms of DDG-51s after 22, I think we will have another multi-year. We'll put the geometry of that together as we kind of lock down the exact details of the shipbuilding plan.
Yes, sir. And you're the second person that's noted the savings that comes with doing it that way, and having that flexibility, obviously, is a good thing.
Just to add, sir, from an operational perspective, I echo everything everyone said. We need the Flight 3 DDG because of its attendant air and missile or advanced missile defense radar for all the capabilities it brings that Admiral Murs discussed last year, and I reiterate this year. I think the path forward we have to work out. There's a large surface combatant in our future because the Flight 3 is dense. We've got about as much as we can get out of it.
Maxed out. I know. I've gotten really familiar with the platform, but there's going to be a gap. We're not there yet.
I don't think it obviates the utility of the Flight 3, though, in the interim and maybe well into the future. So I just want to support that requirement and need for that ship.
Yep. And also, just reiterating some of the comments of my colleagues. I've spent a lot of time up at Bath Iron Works. A lot of members of this committee have highlighted, I think, legitimate concerns about the funding proposal for shipbuilding this year. I wanted to take note of a second-order effect of just waxing and waning shipbuilding rates and the uncertainty that causes with the workforce. You know, not just talking about the companies themselves and their confidence levels. It's the workforce. One might always find a willing company, but they can't build ships without a skilled shipbuilding workforce. You know, I could tell you with the DDG 1000, they started working with new tools, a new sequence of putting together a destroyer, then they were whipped right back to going back to the DDG 51. Now they're relearning an old skill set. We have a very skilled old workforce from the boom cycle, now trying to, you know, be matched with a young, inexperienced workforce as we're coming out of a bus. That's the bathtub. Really, that's the need for consistency right there for the workforce. Is before we lose these people as they go out and retire, we're trying to hire at the same time. Those young folks are looking for consistency. They want to know that this is a career and a good paying job and that they should be making those investments in the skills that it requires to first get and then keep that job. So let me just encourage everyone to please be supportive of the efforts of this committee to get you the resources that you need with consistency. This is something the Secretary of Defense talked about in a letter to Chairman Smith just a few weeks ago, yet we only see 7 ships this year and 10 less in the 5-year projection than projected last year. That doesn't send a very strong signal to working men and women that might be thinking about making this a career.
Yes, sir. I was just up at Bath and again, very impressed. The Vice CNO actually went to all the shipyards other than NASCO, and he'd been at Newport News before. And again, I will reiterate, it is all about the workforce. It is about consistent, stable funding and programs. We're doing that in the programmatics. Again, my comment is not that we don't care about the workforce, and that's not a constraint. My comment was, we have the workforce now, we have the capacity now to generate 355 ships if we stay on it and we have consistency. There are some that question whether we could do it, whether we had the resources or not. I don't question the ability of the industrial base to perform as long as we have a steady and consistent demand signal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Golden. Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Kirby, a couple of questions regarding 2 classes of ships, one apparently leaving and one coming. LCS, you're going to retire 4 of those well in advance of their service life. Can you walk the committee through the rationale for that? And then on the large unmanned surface vessel, what is that beast? What's the propulsion system, weapons, why, and what will she be doing in the fleet? If you walk us through both of those.
Yes, sir. So first, LCS, again, we follow the priority scheme I laid out, Columbia, readiness, capability, capacity. As we looked at our budget for 21, we looked at how much money it would cost for for LCS 1 through 4, $1.2 billion in the fit-up, and how much it would cost collectively to upgrade those ships, which were our first models, $600 million total. And we viewed that that money could be applied in other areas in accordance with that prioritization scheme to produce a better outcome. We didn't want to do it. I think there's great capability in the LCS class, and we need those ships in the future to have a mix to allow those ships to do what they're designed to do. When I deployed on a carrier strike group as a commander in 2017, I used a destroyer to do maritime fisheries enforcement. That's not a great use for a DDG. It is a pretty good use for an LCS. Onto the unmanned surface vehicle, I think we're still in the prototype stage for that. We don't want to count those as ships now. It's premature to do that, and we have work to do for you to have confidence in the testing and certification of that capability in the future. So I don't know that I have an idea on the propulsion system. There's a couple models out there that we're looking at now, but the idea of an LUSV would be to serve as an adjunct magazine for those frigates and other ships in a distributed maritime environment to allow us to have greater depth to operate and against the adversary we think we're going to fight against.
So apparently I've been around here long enough. I was actually at the launch of the USS Fort Worth, and so I've been here too long now. She's being decommissioned, which is about weird. I didn't think I'd been here that long. But the LCS class in general, since I've been here, has been almost an orphan looking for a job. And let's make sure that this unmanned system isn't the same kind of beast where we come up with a good idea and then discover that we then have to find a mission for those ships at the same time. So appreciate your great efforts. Keep up the good work, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Conaway. I don't think you've been there that long. You know, that's Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Chairman. Gentlemen, I think you're hearing from both sides of the aisle. We've got to get our act together. I've run a company, and as a CEO, and the main thing that you have to have is predictability. I mean, you have to have it, and I don't see how our industrial base has predictability from a zigzag seesaw plan that's been coming out of the Pentagon in this case. And I think it's just worth noting. I know you all know this, but it is worth noting for the record. According to RAND, between 2014 and 2018, China launched more submarines, warships, amphibious vessels, and auxiliaries than the number of ships currently serving in the individual navies of Germany, India, Spain, and the United Kingdom. and will continue to commission ships at a similar rate, which would put it on par with 100 submarines in the next 15 years. I don't see how, with what you have come to the Congress with here, that we compete with that, to be completely blunt and candid. So I think I would love to have a follow-on sit-down and understand this better, because clearly I'm missing something. And I don't think, bottom line is, I think the Navy's pricing itself out of business. If you look at the cost of these ships with how we have to then compete, I just don't see with and I'm glad some of my colleagues raised the issue, what we're calling a flat top line were tremendous increases in the last few years with personnel costs that are trending to eat up more and more of that budget, how you recap, modernize, and procure. I'm not seeing the math. So I'd ask for a follow-on to better understand that, if you want to address that now, and then I just have one follow-on question.
No, sir, happy to go through in that whatever level of detail you want. It is a very difficult equation, particularly when we're doing a generational replacement of our ballistic missile submarine force, which right now is going to be about 25% of the traditional shipbuilding budget, will grow to about 33%.
But let's address the elephant in the room. One of the things that is driving up costs to just an unsustainable level is unpredictability on the industrial base.
Yes, sir.
I mean, do you disagree? Do you agree or disagree with that?
I agree with your
as a business owner, I mean, you're going to bake that into your product cost.
Absolutely. We're trying to manage some of the unpredictability by the multi-year and block buy contracts. That's allowed us to create some stability.
Mr. Gertz, it's irresponsible to the taxpayer. I mean, and it's in the defense of this country. I mean, we have to do better.
Yes,
we're either going to have gaps in the out year. I mean, the same time the size of the Chinese Navy eclipse ours, we're going to have all kinds of other debt and entitlement issues. We have to do better, and we all, I think, want to be a partner here in helping you get there. But we have to do better than what we're receiving. Just in my remaining time on the ASW piece, again, the Second Fleet stating that the East Coast has seen an ever-increasing number of Russian submarines right off the Atlantic. Submarines are more capable than ever, deploying for longer period of times with more lethal weapon system. But we're seeing cuts in the P8. While we've had some good success in recapping the sonobuoy inventory, we're also seeing requests come over to recap sonobuoys that aren't even in production yet. Some things don't make sense there. I asked Secretary Modley and the Chief to come back to me on that. I'd appreciate that follow-on. And just back to my original point, the acting secretary in the posture hearing, in a very candid moment, said we're going to have to talk about more money for the Navy. I mean, just because the math doesn't add up. I don't see that happening. So again, we have to. The cost driver to me is personnel and predictability to drive the cost of the individual platforms down. But I welcome a follow-on with you.
Yes, sir. Happy to follow on both the subjects you raised.
Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Waltz. And the last of our first round, because we've got a little time. Looks like votes are until 4 o'clock, so we'll have time for a second round. But Mr. Whitman, you bat cleanup.
Yeah, thank you. Well, gentlemen, thanks much for joining us. I wanted to follow up on Mr. Courtney's original question. Secretary Gertz, the budget request comes over for 1 Virginia-class submarine. The CNO says on his unfunded priority list that adding another Virginia-class submarine would be at the top of his list. You talked around the issue of capacity in the industry. You talked in general that it does have the capacity to build more ships. Is there capacity in the industry to build that additional Virginia-class?
Yes, sir.
Is the reason that additional Virginia-class was taken out of the budget because of financial reasons?
Yes, sir. There's an affordability.
Affordability. So was it a matter of priorities? Was it a matter of someone saying, well, we're going to take some money out for some strategic purposes, that the bill payer was the Virginia-class submarine?
Sir, the SecDef has a lot of different priorities he's balancing, and so, I was not, I shouldn't speak for him on how he evaluated all those priorities.
If you were asked the priorities between the strategic, funding that the money was taken out in a Virginia-class submarine. What would your professional judgment and opinion be to the SecDef?
Sure. The SecDef, has to weigh a lot of those.
I'm
It's
just
broader
asking
than first
I'm
and
just
Navy.
asking what your professional opinion would be.
I think, quite frankly, both are important. We need to be able to produce the weapons for our platforms, and we need to be able to produce submarines. And to the point earlier, we also need to continue to look for ways, whether it's acquisition methods, creating more stability, enhancing the workforce to drive the costs down of platforms. We've driven a lot of cost out so far. I think there's additional activities we can go. So my job is not to make those strategic decisions as much as offer the best ways we know how to get capability, right ships out there at the right time.
But your job is to give the best professional advice up the chain of command.
Yes, sir. My advice was we can execute that second 21 ship should funding be available.
Gotcha. Very good. Let me ask too, you alluded to this partially before, building an additional Virginia-class submarine this year and building 10 as part of the Block 4 buy de-risks Columbia. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I think you're asking if we went to 222 across that multi-year, does that stabilize things and de-risk Columbia? A stable Virginia program is the #1 risk reducer to a Columbia program.
Gotcha. Let me ask about surge sea lift capacity. We've been all over the place with creating the necessary sea lift. We see that the authorization from Congress was to buy 2 used ships with the option to buy 5 additional used ships. We see that that's the direction the Navy proposed, but then we also now hear, the Navy proposing to purchase used ships, but also build new ships, a specific design for a specific purpose. Now we hear that there's also a plan to say we're going to move forward and just buy used ships. Can you give us some clarification as to what the path forward is for our ready reserve fleet? Because you have the 2 and 5 authorization now. There's also a direction to say let's build a purpose-driven ship within the U.S. industry. So can you clarify where we are and what's going on in time frames for surge sea lift?
Yeah, sure. Again, I think we have we're all sensitive that we need to actually get after this problem in earnest, not just on the margins. The Navy laid in program to as rapidly as we could afford, lay in used ship purchase, 2 in 21, another 1 in 22, as well as laid in money in the out years on 23 for a future new build ship. The legislative proposal that came over from the administration, I think, reflects a concern and maybe a misunderstanding. I think we've already been working with the staff. I think there was a sense we were constrained as to going after the used ones depending on the interpretation of that statute. I think there's likely some things we can do to work together. In my mind, we should try and buy as many of the used ones as we can of that 7 as fast as we can afford.
Yes.
But quite frankly, we also have to work together that buying very expensive ships for this mission is going to put at risk some of the other things we need to do. And so I think there's more work to go. We had an idea of a common hull for everything. I think after our market survey results, that may not be the best answer. And so more work to go on our side on the acquisition options and costs so that we can get the right balance of quickly infuse some new used ships to get some of the really old ships out of the ready reserve fleet and then create a sustainable path for a new build.
I think you're right. I think the delta we see between a $60 million used ship and a projected $500 million new ship is too big a delta. There's a lot of things that I think we can do, and we can have some continued conversations there. Let me ask one more question before I will go back for the second round. I want to talk about unmanned. The Navy is pursuing unmanned surface ships with Sea Hunter and with unmanned underwater vessels with Orca. All those have yielded, I think, some good information. The key going forward, though, I believe, is this. We can take those as single systems, and we can test them, and we can say, do they perform? Can they operate autonomously out there? And that's a fairly simple problem set and mission set. What we haven't done is to say, how do you integrate those platforms into the mission sets of a carrier strike group, of a destroyer squadron, of a submarine deployment, whether it's Ohio class or whether it's Virginia class. So the question now becomes, it's great to say, well, let's build a bunch of them. But just as Mr. Conway said, the danger with that is building a bunch of stuff before we have a clear vision about how it is going to be integrated into the fleet, how that platform fights. Secretary Esper said, not unmanned, but lightly manned. So there's a whole dichotomy about how you even implement these elements. Give me some perspective on how the Navy sees the path forward. Listen, we need unmanned, but my deep concern is this, is that we're going to jump headlong into the deep end of the pool, and then we're going to do a bunch of stuff. We're going to go, you know what, some of this stuff doesn't work, and now we've got a bunch of platforms out there that we're going to retire early because we said, wrong decision. And listen, I don't mind us taking risks, but you take risk on the small scale. You say, let's do 2 or 3 of these and fully figure out fleet integration, and then let's ramp up the building. But give me your perspective on that.
Yes, sir. I'll kind of maybe from the acquisition and technology perspective, and Admiral Kilby or General Smith from a warfighting. I think the biggest risk in the unmanned platforms isn't the technology, it's the integration into the warfighting and how to best use them. I saw the same thing early days at SOCOM on unmanned aviation, and finding out what things unmanned aviation was good for and what things it wasn't good for, and getting that balance right. There isn't, unlike a Ford, a huge technology leap or technology. There's some technology to work. And so I think a reasonable number of prototypes to get in the fleet in a reasonable number is important. We have been fairly leaned forward in the budget in terms of how many we've laid in as potential production. That has to be proven. We have to give ourselves and you comfort. We've been, again, fairly forward-leaning in that. We have options, obviously, to roll off of that. What we're really trying to do now is get enough of them in the sailors' hands so that they can help us decide where they add to the mission and then how best to integrate them. Admiral Kilby.
Hey, thanks. Just a quick addendum to that. One vehicle to do that is the Surface Warfare Development Squadron that was stood up in San Diego by Vice Admiral Brown. So that's under command of Captain Hank Adams, and the benefit of having that in San Diego is a lot of our West Coast Comp 2Xs happen off San Diego. So not only can we do the testing and certification, which I admit we owe you a better detailed plan. I've talked to both the SASC and the HASC staffers about how to do that, but also that proximity of those exercises can allow us to employ those ships and see and measure the effects and see how that integration works. So I think that's one step of how we're going to instantiate that. Also, we're going to use unmanned in RIMPAC and our large-scale exercises. So I think you'll see increasing push from us to kind of employ those and then report back on what we see, sir.
And I think of this as a scale issue. One, can it do something? And then is it something we want to scale? Two separate important questions, and we've got to get that balance right.
I would agree. The scaling question includes first capability and then capacity. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. So we've finished the first round, and again, we'll now begin the second. I'll start, and again, I'm going to do the 5-minute clock for myself, and so we all get a chance to ask a second round of questions. So, you mentioned that we're now at the beginning of construction for Columbia, which is going to be, as Admiral Kilby said, a top priority, and that's been reiterated for years. In 2014, Congress passed the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund, and again, that was because we recognized the bow wave of this cost was fast approaching. Given, in I think the opinion of the Seapower committees, believe that it's a strategic asset, much more than really a Navy-only asset, we felt it was justified to take it off the shoulders of the shipbuilding account. So far, it's an operation, but it's still being sort of included in the top line of shipbuilding, and we're going to continue to raise that issue with this administration as we did with the prior administration. One aspect of it, though, that was undeniably beneficial was the fact that we put in authorities to create more efficiencies in shipbuilding, continuous production authorities. Mr. Labs is here from the Congressional Budget Office, who analyzed that a number of years ago and determined that, in fact, it would provide real efficiencies and at least help some cost relief in terms of the program. With the budget this year, the administration is requesting incremental authority, which I think we welcome in terms of the subcommittee. Can you talk a little bit about, again, what that benefit is in terms of the contracting process you're in right now, and what the downside would be if we did not include that incremental authority in terms of Columbia?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Columbia will be unexecutable without the incremental funding authority. The authorities that have been in the fund have been tremendously useful. We've started advanced construction on every one of the modules. We've leveraged continuous production to get ahead of issues, smoke out problems that have plagued us in the past, missile tube welding being one of them. So those authorities have been tremendously useful, but without the incremental authorities for the first two Columbias, the way we have it set up right now, we will not be able to execute. We will likely also need your help in the event that there's a CR, that assuming the department will request an anomaly, we'll need your help with that, because our intent, to meet the timelines we have, we can't afford any delays. We are working hard on the contract, getting that negotiating, having that all in place. Very good progress on that, but we will have to get that moving as quickly as possible as soon as the 21 budget turns over on the 1st October.
Well, if you're saying it's unexecutable, that's about as much clarity as we could ask for in terms of getting us to move forward. In my last few minutes, I wanted to actually go back to just a housekeeping issue, which is some of the reporting on the delays in Block 4 that was in the some of the press last week. And number one, Block 4 contract, just like Block 5 and its predecessors, and the same with DDGs or the block contract with the carriers, those are fixed price contracts. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, they are.
So any delays which were reported in the reporting, I mean, the fact is the taxpayer didn't bear the burden of any delay. Is that correct?
No, sure. And then, and recall on Block 4, we also accelerated, and we gave ourselves a goal of accelerating those deliveries by 6 months from our nominal Block 3. And so in the reporting you saw quoted a delay, but it was a delay against an accelerated contract delivery goal we had set.
And again, when we talk about delivery, I mean, there's obviously the contract date, as you point out, which you tried to accelerate, but then there's the construction delivery date, and then there's delivery to the fleet. And in fact, the Block 4 submarines have actually been performing well in terms of the final real test of quality and ability of the Navy to use the submarine. So again, could you talk a little bit about that delivery to the fleet versus contract delivery date?
Yeah, yes, sure. I mean, some of the reporting was, I'll call interim milestones, and contract delivery dates are important, but what I measure my performance on is delivery to the fleet. And even with the dates we talk about in terms of contract deliveries, we're still forecasting Block 4 to deliver 5 months earlier on average than Block 3 to the fleet. Somewhat remarkably, 3 years earlier than Block 1 boats in terms of span time. And with very high quality.
Because that just reinforces the question of execution ability. Because, I mean, in fact, it's a positive trend that we've been seeing with Block 4.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. And Ms. Luria.
Well, thank you. And I wanted to go back to the comment that you made initially, Secretary Gertz, was no constraints on the industrial base. Well, I had a few minutes to think about that during this time. Clearly we're talking about shipbuilding overall here in this budget, but we're also talking about maintenance. And the cheapest ship we have is the ship that we have if we maintain it properly and train the crew and man it and equip it. And so I was just thinking through my head, looking around the waterfront in Norfolk Naval Shipyard. We're in a situation now where CVN 77 is in Norfolk Naval Shipyard for a 28-month availability. I brought this up last year. Design, Nimitz-class, first availability, docking availability, and their life cycle, it was 10.5 months. That's extended over time. Understand that now we would anticipate that to maybe be 16, but that's fully a year over what's anticipated. And the reason for that is capacity, because we prioritize the MTS conversion, we prioritize the refueling of the Wyoming, because we had a problem with manpower, and the public shipyard being able to accommodate that work, but it's all one ecosystem that's tied together. And if you look across the waterfront in any fleet concentration area, we are struggling to get these availabilities done on time. And that is not because there are no constraints in the industrial base. There's a limited amount of manpower, there's a limited amount of facilities, and the facilities that we have, as you have noted, are aging, and we're not investing in them appropriately. The public shipyards, for example, the shipyard modernization, we need to put a significant investment in that. Do you agree? And so I'm just kind of stuck on this no constraints thing because I think it's completely incorrect. But I wanted to move on to something else more quickly that some of my other colleagues brought up. You know, Mr. Conway said that, you know, the LCS seems to be a platform looking for a mission. The CNO quoted at the SNA West Symposium, I read that, quote unquote, for LCS, progress is being made on various mission modules, ASW, AMW, surface warfare. Where are we with these mission modules? What's our plan? And what truly is the capability that we're deploying them with? And maybe Admiral Kilby is the one who can respond to that.
Yes, ma'am. There are 1,000 constraints on the industrial base, and I'm happy to talk to you. I guess where I was saying was, if we get stability and efficiency, even in ship repair, we are not as efficient using the resources we have because of instability, because of some of the business models. I think the raw capacity exists if we work our way out there, but I'll talk to you maybe separately on that because I think what I'm trying to communicate is not being communicated clearly by myself. In terms of LCS, Jim, if you want to talk about where we are warfighting perspective.
Yeah, thanks. So just the three separate rules, ma'am. One, the ASW package has a variable depth active sonar, which would be very useful in the case of the
I don't need a full summary of what their capabilities are. Like, what is the deployability of them? Are they installed on the ships? Are the modules ready? Is it fully developed? And are sailors trained? And are they using them?
The surface warfare module is ready to go. The ASW module will be ready shortly, and the mine warfare one will be the last one due. That's why we.
So they're almost ready, but we're about to start decommissioning this class of ships. I mean, do you see where I'm going with this? There's a credibility issue here, and now you want to come build something new with these unmanned surface vessels, which once again, we haven't fully developed the concept or the technology in order to build them and or employ them effectively. So you keep coming to the table asking us to build new things, but we don't know how we're going to use them, how they fit into our strategy, and why they're important. And so if we have to make choices, you know, we got to rack and stack it. Nuclear deterrent is the cornerstone of our national security. It puts the Columbia-class submarine at the top. If you ask us where we need more capability, fast attack submarines, we clearly know that there's a shortage there, yet we're cutting a Virginia-class submarine this year. So it seems like a credibility issue because we're asking for things that we don't even know how we're going to use and haven't been developed technologically, yet we're not necessarily prioritizing both the capabilities that we know that we need and the industrial facilities such as the shipyard modernization that's going to support our ability to maintain those assets. If you care to comment.
Yeah, just back to the LCS 1 through 4, ma'am. Again, it was we don't think those ships are valuable. It was an affordability decision. The cost to maintain those ships and the cost to modernize them, $600 million, was viewed as not as great.
That's exactly my point, Admiral. That wasn't what we thought when we came here and asked for the money to build them in the first place. We thought that they were going to be fully capable, we were going to develop them, deploy them exactly as designed, but that's not what happened. And I probably don't need to remind you as well of the Ford and the designs that we put in with catapults, arresting gear, dual band radar, and weapons elevators, all of which were designed but not operational as designed when first built. And just quickly, you know, the CNO also said at SNA West that, you know, the elevators, he gave an assessment that 4 are complete, 7 will be done by the end of the summer, and then 4 more, the remaining 4, by the end of 21. But he also said we're not repairing them, we're building them. So we're at this point in the ship's life when it should have already deployed and we're just now building them. Like, it doesn't make sense.
Yes, ma'am. For the weapons elevators, it is finishing the construction of those, not repairing previously constructed assets.
I do not accept that answer. I have spent hours on the Ford. I have climbed in those elevator shafts, and I know that when you built them the first time, you thought you built them properly. So if we're going to do semantics between building and repairing something that was built wrong, We could do that all day, but you didn't intend to build them twice and delay the deployment of the ship by 6 years when you first started building it. Is that correct?
That is not the way we intended to build that ship.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lieutenant General Smith, I wanted to follow up on the Commandant and his vision in the planning document for where the Marine Corps is going. He talked about a smaller amphibious ship that would operate in a more distributed way. I think that concept is something that he is talking about in response to having the ability for the Marine Corps to be more flexible and more adaptable, to have a little less predictability about where it's located, to be able to mitigate some risk, be able to reduce some risk. Can you give us an idea about this concept and how this vision would be implemented based on this year's budget? Because I know our interest is saying, well, how much of the direction in the Commandant's planning guidance can be executed in this year's budget? So kind of give me an idea about that concept and then where it starts this year and what path it'll be on.
Yes, sir. So the Commandant has stated that this budget, 21, is the point upon which we pivot to the future force, to his vision. And you'll see that then instantiated in 22, 23, and 24. As far as the concept, the concept of, it's in his planning guidance that it would be illogical to place all of your resources into a few large amphibs. It's not that they don't have value, because they do. We like to say that an advanced expeditionary, the EABO, Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations, the best advanced or expeditionary advanced base is a floating mobile platform that moves 17 to 20 knots a day, which Texas math at 17 knots a day is 408 nautical miles in a day. A mix of those ships, or of a future light amphibious warship and the, quote, traditional amphibious warship, gives someone like me, as a former 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force commander out in the Pacific, tremendous flexibility, because getting to the first island chain and then operating within the first island chain, two very different things. And if we're going to impose costs, to your point, sir, and I know to Chairman Courtney's position too about the pacing threat of our adversaries, they are constantly moving. We have to be able to impose costs and challenges on them. A mix of those warships, traditional and lighter, gives that operational flexibility to the Fleet Marine Force commander in support of the fleet commander, guys like Admiral Kilby in the future or Admiral Sawyer in the past, so that we can truly impose a cost on a pacing threat. We have to be able to move within that first island chain, and the lighter amphibious warship is going to allow us to do that. I hope that answers your question, sir.
Yeah, I think that gives us some concept. Tell me about this, too. I know that as well as having smaller ships that are distributed, the idea, too, is to be able to support Marines on land. So instead of having to do forcible entries all the time, you actually have some Marines situated in the region, and then move them around. So say, hey, listen, it's a flexible, adaptable force. Our adversaries don't quite know where it is or quite how it's going to operate or what quite its opportunities are there. Is that a complement to the ships that you talk about being there in theater, or the larger number of smaller ships and moving them around? Can you give us a little idea on that?
Sir, it is absolutely complementary. An expeditionary advanced base, for example, that unit that may go in there, 50 to 60 Marines, that provides maritime strike in support of that fleet commander. Once that unit is ashore, they can conduct moves across the land and not need to return to the sea base for some period of time. It could be hours or it could be days. And the force that we're designing has that ability to stand in, to persist inside the weapons engagement zone, not just the equipment, but the training and the organization, so that is a truly lethal, credible threat that is highly mobile and then returns to the sea base at a point of our choosing, not the point of an adversary's choosing.
So your intention is to begin that execution in this year's budget?
Sir, this is the pivot. Some of the things General Berger took over, and obviously he had just the budget was largely done by the time he became the Commandant. He made some significant changes in 21. A lot of it was in training and education, so that when these systems come online, his focus is, I have to have the unit that is prepared to use it. If Moore's Law writ large comes into effect, that unit has to be ready to execute using the systems available at the time. We can't find some some technological solution, and then have to create a unit to employ it. Our HIMARS units, our high mobility artillery rocket systems, for example, can fire a missile that actually strikes a ship. We're the littoral combat force. Why would we not do that? We don't do that now. We will do that as part of this budget, sir.
Good, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Mr. Golden, you get the final word.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Boyd, General Smith, I'm getting excited listening to you talk about this.
That makes two of us, sir. I get excited as well.
I can tell. You know, I just want to follow up on that. I've been reading the Commandant's planning and guidance, following the blogs that are out there with Marines, you know, at the lower levels talking about this and thinking about it. Look, I was on deployment in Afghanistan, right up on the border of Pakistan, in a platoon plus unit with just the LT and a gunny as the people running the show. Well out in advance, very self-sufficient, very flexible. Loved it. I've been on a completely different kind of deployment in Iraq. So I love what you're saying right there about the 50 to 60 man unit. But you know, one thing that comes to mind for me as the Commandant talks about this pivot back towards being on the Navy ship, I only got to go on one short deployment cycle out off the coast of Virginia and do a splash, come back in, spend all of about 5 days on the ship. I did 4 years active duty, and on top of that, time in the reserves. I feel like this is such an incredible opportunity and a challenge for the Marines to be getting back to its foundational, you know, mission. And I just got to say, things don't happen so fast here. You know, kind of like I would compare it to that platoon I was in Afghanistan versus like the trying to move around a division. Here in Congress, it sounds nice that you're going to start, you know, thinking about the next budget cycle to implement the Commandant's guidance. Start coming to talk to our offices now, talking to these committees now, because if you start engaging next January, you may run into some unanticipated roadblocks. I'm extending an invitation to you, to the Commandant, to come to my office or anyone on this committee. I'm sure you know, Mr. Whitman would be more than excited to do that. I wanted to ask you very quickly about that, though. You know, the training that goes into getting young Marines, young leaders that have been fighting in the Middle East back onto the Navy platform and ready to fight. You know, I envision fighting on the ship, fighting off the ship, fighting ashore. Last week, when Commandant Berger was here, he said that the Marine Corps has benefited greatly from being a joint partner in the Close Combat Lethality Task Force, and that the Marines have no choice but to continue that important work. Next, you know, last week I had the Army here, or maybe that was a couple of days ago. I lose track of time in this place. We had the Army here. They said they were going to happily take that job into the Army Department and no longer have it be joint with the Marine Corps. You know, to me, that's the difference between cooperation and integration and coordination, like you were just talking about. And you may have a young Marine trigger puller, like an enlisted guy like myself, or a young officer there in cooperation. But it's not the same thing as integration and a joint service leadership team running that task force. And I have a lot of concerns about changing it from what it has been. Fighting in the environment you're talking about is much different than the Army mission, or at least it should be. So I wanted to ask if you have any concerns with the proposal to move that program into the Army instead of continuing the Joint Task Forces General Mattis and others, including Army Major General Scales, envisioned to begin with.
So, sir, flipping the tables, thank you for your service. It usually gets said the other way around, but thank you.
Thank you for yours.
Thanks, sure. So I just met with General Murray, Commanding General of the Futures Command. I also lose track of time, so I can't remember if it was Monday or Tuesday this week. But I actually don't have any concerns about the CTLTF, the Close Combat Lethality Task Force, begun by then Secretary Mattis and actually run by a guy that I fought with in Iraq, a guy named Joe Latwell, commanded 2-7 when I had 1-5. Sir, we are so tightly tied here within the naval component, but I think people forget that we are extremely closely tied in with the Army component. We are daily in contact and in collaboration, true collaboration with the Army on systems. And so When that close combat lethality task force goes back to the Army as the lead, it will have Marines still in it. So we are still completely committed, because what we owe you is when you can buy in bulk, quote unquote, and save the taxpayer money, if we're at the 85% solution, we can't be different just to be different. We have to be together with them, because we still share although we are the maritime component, we have to have the ability to project power ashore and sustain ourselves ashore, which is more similar in many ways to the Army. And I would say General Murray and I and his deputy are very closely tied in the CCLTF. I don't have concerns about that going back to the Army, sir. I really don't. I feel like we've been included, and we will continue to be included. Coordinate where we can. Certain things as a naval character force are different and have to be so, but wherever possible, sir, we have to be in line with them.
Well, my top concern, obviously, is decision-making authority. Let's make sure the Marines that are there are getting the top-level support they need to speak up and make sure that we are thinking about the Marine Corps as well. And in closing off, I guess the last word, Saturday at 9 a.m., I've got an appointment to get that buzz cut right up to about like yours. I try and do it once a month instead of every Sunday.
I know a couple of good barbers, sir. So.
Semper Fi.
Semper Fidelis, sir. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jared, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. You know, it's yeah. So, well, thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I think, as you can tell, the members are passionate about you know, our subcommittee's work, and we appreciate, again, it was a good, frank discussion today, and it's going to continue, obviously, through the markup process. So, with that, I'll declare the hearing adjourned.
Thanks, Jim.
Yep. Thanks, Pat.